All right, let's go ahead and get started. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for being here. First of all, apologies for canceling class. I really very rarely just outright cancel class, but I was sick. I had a cold the last couple of days and just not feeling up for it. So I apologize. I have been testing myself every morning. It's not COVID, but for whatever it is, I don't want to risk anyone else getting sick. So I'm going to keep a mask on for the next several days just to keep it away from everybody. But yeah, feeling mostly better. I hope that there's not junk going around campus right now either. I know that there's a little bit of COVID going around right now. So just as a reminder, if you are feeling some sniffles, not feeling up for it, stay home. I've tried to make as many accommodations as I can to make it not too detrimental for you to miss class. As much as I want you to be here in person, let's really try to work together to reduce the spread of whatever bugs around campus. But yeah, I apologize. We'll pick things up. We have a little bit of leeway in the syllabus in terms of the schedule for both lecture and lab. So we will pick up what we missed on Monday and Tuesday. And with that in mind, today we're going to wrap up our discussion of embryology and jump into histology. So our agenda today looks like this. We're going to start off revisiting embryology, have just a little bit of review for you, what we covered last week on Friday in our last lecture, and then just a short activity to get your brain engaged with the embryology material. And then we're going to start in talking about histology. So that is the study of different tissue types, and that ties in perfectly to what we'll cover in lab. And in a way, it's actually nice that we're going to have time to cover this in more detail in lecture today and Friday before you see your lab on this on Tuesday next week. And then finally, we'll wrap things up, and I have a ticket out for you at the end of class and just a few reminders about course logistics and that kind of thing. So before we get back to embryology, what questions, Gia? You do, and I have some details about that in your class program as well as at the end of lecture today. Well, yes, I'll just wait till the end of class. I'll give you that information, but yeah. Good, thanks for asking that. Other questions? All right, let's go back and get your brain back thinking about embryology. Just as a way of reminder, you've seen this slide before, but I want to just remind you that we generally divide the prenatal development in humans into two parts. The first period, lasting the first 8 weeks from fertilization, beginning with fertilization, is referred to as the embryonic period. The embryonic period is notable because, well, let me talk about that in more detail in a second. Then the second part of prenatal development from 8 weeks on to birth, generally about week 38, between week 38 and 40, it can vary, as you know. We refer to that as the fetal period. Now, the embryonic period is important because this is when those germ layers are created, and this is where all of the basic organ systems get started. So this is the time period when molecules known as teratogens. So that can be pollutants, that can be alcohol that is consumed by the mom. It can be viruses. This is the time period when those molecules can really cause major damage and disrupt development, because that's the time when all of those all of those organ systems are being laid down and the foundation is being laid down. And a small kind of change at the very beginning of development can lead to more dramatic changes later in development. Now, embryonic period is when those 3 germ layers are laid down. You remember that they are referred to as the ectoderm, mesoderm, and endoderm. So in your notebook right now, we're going to play a quick matching game. So just simply make this little table in your notebook and match the germ layer to the structure that match it to the structure that it creates. So the structure that emerges, that's a better way to say it, from each of those germ layers. So just make that table and then draw a line connecting them. I'll show you the answer in a second. Just a review activity here. Bless you. I see a couple of you don't have your name tags. You have those. You have that hand. You have your name tag handy. If you have it, grab it. If not, I have paper and a marker for you. I'm just trying to get everyone's names down at the beginning of the semester. It's a small class, so it should be good. Cool. Thanks. Okay, let's go ahead. You should have drawn something that looks like this. The ectoderm, remember that is the outermost layer of the three germ layers. And that gives rise to the central nervous system, which is the brain and the spinal cord, as well as what else? Go ahead and yell it out. Skin, yep, skin and integumentary system that we'll talk about in detail, probably starting next week. The mesoderm is that middle germ layer, and that gives rise to your skeletal muscle. Also, a number of organs such as the kidneys and other kind of the viscera in the center part of your body. So the mesoderm is the middle layer that gives rise to your muscles. And finally, the endoderm is the innermost layer. That was in yellow on the diagrams. And that produces the lining, the respiratory system, as well as the lining of the digestive system. So the lining of the intestines there. And we can go back to the diagram, take a look at this. This ectoderm, remember, is the blue layer on the outside, gives rise to the skin and integumentary system, as well as the central nervous system. The yellow is that endoderm, giving rise to the lining of the gut. And then the red is the mesoderm, which is kind of the most complicated in that it forms the most different kinds of tissue types. But generally, we can think of it as giving rise to your muscle, your bone, and other organs, including the kidneys, as I mentioned, and a number of others. That's just a bit of review. What questions do you have about that before we get into new material? Got you. Good question. So that's kind of more of a general term for some of the connective tissue that holds together all of the organs kind of in your abdomen and in your thoracic cavity. So basically in your like torso, it's all of the tissues that basically keep everything in place. It's also often used to refer to kind of the different parts of the digestive system, although I mean it here separate from the actual lining of the body. I mean like accessory organs like your pancreas and your liver and things like that. That's a really good question. Yep, Matt.
No, it's the two skin layers and what they form from.
Yes, so you have the epidermis is the outermost skin layer that's formed from your ectoderm, and then you have the dermis, which is actually formed from the mesoderm. And we're going to get into that in detail when we talk about the integumentary system. And actually, you're going to see that on your cats starting, well, it was supposed to have been yesterday, but next week you'll see that when you, the first step in your cat dissection is to look at those skin layers, and you'll see the epidermis and the dermis underneath it. Yep, good. Thanks for asking that. Good question. Bless you. Other questions? Okay, let's talk now about the fetal period, which again, remember, is after 8 weeks post-fertilization until birth. And I'm not going to say a whole bunch about this. Basically, it's just the time when all of those organs get bigger and more developed. And that's everything is just kind of expanding in size and also kind of filling out its place in the body where it will be for the newborn. So it's just continued growth and development. We spend a lot of time on the embryonic period, fetal period. That's really all we're going to say about that. Just getting bigger. There's some important things that develop during this time as well. For example, one aspect of the body that develops greatly during this time is your glands and your ability to produce different secretions and fluids and things like that. And a great example of this is a fluid known as surfactant that's produced in the lungs that helps your lungs to more easily expand and contract. And that's actually one of the main reasons why babies that are born prematurely have such a hard time, because even though many of their organs are developed, they actually haven't developed this surfactant yet. And so it's really difficult for them to breathe air outside of the womb. Of course, when they're in the womb, they don't need to breathe because mom's providing all of the oxygen, et cetera, et cetera. But when they're out of the womb, you need to breathe, but their lungs haven't developed this fluid that helps the air sacs to expand and contract more easily. We'll talk about that in detail when we get to the respiratory system, but that's one example of something that happens during the fetal period that's essential for healthy birth. The researchers discovered this a while back, and it was actually saved a lot of prematurely born babies' lives because they were like, oh, we can produce this surfactant artificially and help these babies breathe. And so they did. All right. I'm going to pause here for a second and have you turn to a partner and do a quick activity. I want you to talk with a partner, and I want you to basically fill in the blanks from this sentence. In human development, the embryonic stage is characterized by blank. So it's going to be more than one word, a phrase here. Whereas during the fetal stage, blank. So just work with a partner or 3 people if it's easier, and just go ahead and see how you would fill in this sentence. And then, yeah, I'll give you a couple minutes to do that. And then I'm going to have you, well, then we'll do the next step. Yep. So go ahead, groups of 2 or 3 are great. I can kind of facilitate that. Veronica and Morgan do good together. Can we do a group of 3 here? Let's hear Julia. And then let's see. You guys want to do 3 and then a group of 3 down here? Is that okay? Yeah, go ahead. Work with groups of 3. I thought partners, but 3 is fine. And go ahead and write it down as well. You're going to need to have it written down. Okay, once you've had a chance to discuss it with your group, go ahead. Oh, I have a timer here. I'll just start the timer now. Go ahead and upload your response. So everybody should fill out a survey, but it's okay if you and your partner have the exact same answer. That's totally fine. But I want to make sure I get the equal survey for everybody. Let me get out of the way. And I set a 2-minute timer for that. If you have any technical difficulties, let me know. You may need to be signed into your OWU account. Try that and see if it works. Yeah. I have it set up so that only OWU community people. That's good. How's the Wi-Fi in this room? Okay, you're into so we'll now. Holly March, Abby, is good. Oh, wow. That was louder than I expected. Sorry. All right. Do you need more time or are you doing okay? 1 second. Okay. Go ahead, Abby.
So like
Yeah.
when organs like don't like form properly,
Mm-hmm.
is that only due to genetics or is it like completely random?
Ah, great question. So when organs don't form properly, is it due to genetics or can it be random? It can be any of the above. It can be due to, it can be certainly due to genetics, right? It can be due to other molecules. We talked about teratogens. So this is a broad term that refers to any molecule that disrupts development. And again, that can be a virus, that can be a pollutant in the environment, that can be something that the mom consumes, any of those kind of molecules. It can also seemingly be random. at times. Sometimes these developmental pathways, as you can imagine, I mean, the complexity of assembling a human being is just like kind of mind-blowing, right? All of these things have to work. I don't want to say perfectly, but they have to work really well together to have a functioning human. And if any one system doesn't work, then the whole person, it's difficult for the whole person to function. So, you know, if your lungs and your digestive system function properly, but your heart doesn't, well, you don't really work. If everything works but your kidneys, well, again, you don't really work. And so sometimes those random things can happen as well to disrupt this. Now, what happens very often is that very, very early in development, something goes awry and the fetus or the embryo, better yet, just stops developing very, very early in pregnancy. In fact, so early that often the mom doesn't even know that she's pregnant yet. She doesn't even know that fertilization has happened. And the fetus, or the, excuse me, fetus, the embryo is spontaneously aborted because it just never forms past this certain early stage. And I don't remember exactly the percentage, but a huge percentage of pregnancies basically end that way, often again with mom having no idea even that fertilization happened. So it could be any of those things. That's a really good question. Other questions? Cool. All right. Well, let's transition then and talk a little bit about histology. We've got a good amount of time left in class today. Histology, simply stated, is the study of tissues. Now, remember tissues, we covered this in our first lecture, and we talked about the kind of hierarchical organization of the body. Tissues are a group of closely associated cells that perform related functions and are similar in structure. So they're basically a group of cells that do something, that work together to do something in your body. And we're going to talk about a whole bunch of different tissue types here in lecture, and then you're going to look at examples of them in the lab on Tuesday under the microscope and learn how to identify those different tissues, learn where they are in the body, and learn a little bit about what they do. So there's 4 basic tissue types that perform 4 basic functions in the body. The first type is called epithelial tissue. And essentially what these tissues do is they provide the covering for different organs in different parts of the body. Now, there's a whole bunch of types of epithelial tissue. We're going to get into that in detail in just a minute. But for now, I want to just introduce these 4 general tissue types. The second tissue type is connective tissue. These provide support for the body. So this is things like cartilage or bone that provide structure and support to the different parts of your body. Also, surprisingly, blood is considered a connective tissue. The third is muscle tissue, which provide movement, not surprisingly. And you have 3 types of muscle tissue. We'll talk about those in detail coming up. You have skeletal muscle, which provides voluntary movement of your limbs in your body. Smooth muscle, which you don't think about as involuntary, that controls things like your digestive system, moving food through your digestive system. And then you have a third kind of muscle that's very special and only found in one place in your body. Anyone know what that is? Yeah, cardiac muscle that's found in your heart. Exactly. We'll talk about that in detail. And finally, you have nervous tissue, which functions to basically control other tissues, to send messages to tell other tissues what they should do. So they tell muscles to contract, or they tell glands to secrete whatever it is they're secreting, or things like that. So they exert control. So every tissue in your body can be described in one of these 4 categories. And what we're going to do is walk through all of these categories in more detail, starting with your epithelial tissue. Now, epithelial tissue, as I just said, forms the covering on different organs and linings of the body. And it can do this in a number of different ways. We can have single cell epithelial tissue where you have 1 layer of cells here, or you can have multiple layers of epithelial cells. So for example, the epidermis of your skin is multiple layers of epithelial cells stacked on top of each other. And as you scratch or itch or just rub up against things, this top layer of cells kind of sloughs off. That's right, all your dead skin cells come off, and then new cells arise from the bottom. And so you constantly have this layer replenished. I forget what percentage, something like, I don't know, a huge percentage of like dust in the air and dusted rooms and stuff is actually sloughed epithelial cells from your skin, which is kind of neat to think about, right? So we have these epithelial cells. They form lining. They can be in single layers. They can be in multiple layers. Epithelial cells also have polarity, which means that one side of the cell is different from the other, and we refer to that specifically as the apical surface and the basal surface. The apical surface is what faces the outside, and the basal surface is what's connected to whatever tissue is below, usually some kind of connective tissue. Now, importantly, I'm saying the apical surface is the side of the cell that goes towards the outside. On your skin, it's kind of obvious which way is outside. But remember, if these cells are lining your digestive system, the outside is actually pointing inwards towards the lumen of your digestive system. So more specifically, or for example, if these were the cells lining your stomach, this apical surface would be facing the inside of your stomach where all your food and stuff is. And this would be, the basal surface would be connected to the connective tissue. And we can look at that in a little more detail here. So this is some epithelial cells in a little more detail. And I want to walk you through some special properties of these epithelial cells, and then we'll talk about different types of epithelial cells in different parts of the body. So here's our epithelial cells. We have the apical surface above, basal surface below. We have the basal surface is attached to the connective tissue. Don't worry too much about this right now. I'll talk about connective tissue in a minute, but I just wanted you to see where it is in relation to these epithelial cells. You notice that there's some nerve endings here as well. This is nervous tissue that might tell these cells to, for example, if they're secreting sweat, it'll tell those cells to secrete sweat if they're sweat glands in those epithelial cells. Now, a couple noteworthy aspects of these epithelial cells. The first is that they have a very narrow extracellular space, meaning that there's not a lot of room between these adjacent cells. This makes sense. If these cells are forming a lining to protect what's underneath or to protect what's underneath them, then you wouldn't want a lot of space between them because then stuff could get through. So for example, your skin is waterproof. If you dip your hand in water, that water doesn't soak into your body, right? That's partially because these cells are so close together and they're bound very tightly. So there's not a lot of space between those epithelial cells. The second important characteristic of these cells is they have these very tight junctions. And there's a couple of different ways that this can happen. We have something called desmosome. We have something called an adhesive belt. I don't need you to worry too much about those structures right now at the molecular level. What I want you to take away is that the cells are tightly bound to each other. So there's very little space between them. And not only that, but they're kind of bound together by these different structures to be kind of to basically act as one unit, even though they're individual cells. And that again serves to keep these cells close together so they can form this impermeable barrier, or more often a barrier that is selectively permeable, meaning that it will only let things through that it wants to let through. Next, we see that epithelial cells exhibit polarity, meaning they have a basal side and an apical side. I talked a little bit about that already. And then fourth, we see that they are attached at the basal side. They're attached to connective tissue. And the connective tissue serves to give them a little more structure and keep them bound to the parts of the body that are below them. And then fifth, these cells are both vascularized, or excuse me, these cells are innervated, meaning that there's nerves going into those epithelial cells, but at the same time, they're avascular, meaning that they have this capillary here that's providing oxygen and taking carbon dioxide from this connective tissue, but it doesn't actually go directly into the epithelial cells, which is important because it means that to get the nutrients that these cells need and other things, they rely on that moving from this connective tissue. So nerve endings go directly to interface with these epithelial cells, but not blood vessels. Blood vessels are only in this connective tissue. which makes it essential that these epithelial cells are associated with that underlying connective tissue. So that is the 5 important characteristics of epithelial cells in diagram form. I'm going to go ahead and give you that in list form here. And I'll just give you a minute to copy this down, make sure it matches the notes that you just took on the diagram as well. And then I want to talk about a couple of these points in a little more detail. So let me just give you a second to make sure you've got those notes, see if you have questions, and then I'll talk about these last 2 bullet points that I haven't covered yet. I do like very much asking about the characteristics of epithelial cells in quizzes and exams. So take note. Okay, so these first 5 points I walked through on the diagram already. Do you have any questions about any of those? Okay, I'm going to give you 2 more pieces of information about epithelial cells. The first is that the lost cells are quickly regenerated. So epithelial cells very often, or almost always, can replace themselves very quickly. And this is essential because they're often in places where they get rubbed off a lot. So I mentioned the outside of your skin, but also, for example, the epithelial cells that line your esophagus. Every time you drink or swallow, you're knocking some of those cells off into your digestive system, and they're being replaced by cells underneath them. So they can regenerate quickly. And finally, the epithelial cells perform a lot of functions, including protection, as I mentioned, but also secretion. We have cells, for example, that your sweat glands that secrete sweat, or that secrete enzymes for digestion or things like that. They also play a role in absorption, which is in your digestive lining, moving nutrients from your food that you swallowed into your body. They also play a role in filtration. So, for example, in your kidneys, they remove certain things from your blood so you can excrete them in your urine. And importantly, they also play a role in sensory reception. So I mentioned that the epithelial cells are innervated. So you have specialized nerve and epithelial cells that allow you to do receive important information from your environment. What are some pieces of information you receive from your environment through your epithelial cells, do you think? Morgan. Temperature, good, excellent. What else? You can just yell it out, it's fine. Touch, yeah, exactly. Tactile, sensory, temperature. You can detect, a good example here is you have little hairs on your arms that vibrate under conditions of wind or things like that, which I guess ties into touch as well, but similar idea. Yeah, so all of those kind of sensory inputs you get through your skin are through those epithelial cells. Questions? Every time you type in your keyboard, got lots of nerve endings, and your fingertips are exquisitely sensitive. Have a lot of finely tuned nerves there. Other parts of your body, it varies a lot. So, for example, your fingertips, your ears, for example, are highly innervated. You have very strong sense of tactile sensory perception in those areas. Other places less so. For example, the middle of your back. Like you can still feel things there, of course, but you don't have that same level of detail that you do with your fingertips. And that's simply because you need that kind of level of resolution in your fingers because you're doing stuff with your fingers versus like other parts in your body. For example, I don't know, side of your leg or something like that. Cool. Gia, question. You are very much so. So I can't tell you in great detail what that process is like, but in general, what you're doing is just freezing these cells so they're no longer functional, and oftentimes freezing the underlying tissue as well. So if you only damage the epidermis, it's not a huge deal with a burn or frostbite. It'll hurt, you'll have a wound, but it will generally heal pretty readily. Where the long-term damage comes in is if you damage the underlying tissue, the dermis that's below these cells, or the underlying connective tissue. And that can be more difficult to heal and can involve nerve damage and things like that. Matt, go ahead.
I've heard that like, if you're like, really, really cold and might have frostbite,
Mhm.
you rub your hands together. There's like this tiny little ice crystal in your hands that actually like way more damage. That's why it's more recommended to like
Blow on your hands, keep them warm.
melt it rather than
Yeah. I don't want to give any advice because I don't know 100%, but that sounds very reasonable to me. Yeah. And because the danger is when you're really cold, you lose your sensory capability. Even if those cells aren't permanently damaged, it kind of dulls that sensory reception a little bit. And so you might be rubbing your hands so much you might actually be hurting yourself, but you don't know it because you can't feel anything. Yeah. So that sounds pretty reasonable to me. Yeah. Karen.
I don't know if this is the same thing. Like a lot of people will eventually start to feel like hot.
Yeah.
Like, take off their clothes because they're just sensory stuff. But I don't know if
That's related.
your brain.
Exactly. That's more of the nervous system being really confused. So hypothermia has to do with your core body temperature becoming too cold, right? Even if you get frostbite in your fingertips, your toes, generally speaking, your brain and your main part of your body is going to maintain a pretty stable temperature. When that temperature starts to drop, that's when you're in real trouble. And that's something like hypothermia. And I don't know exactly the mechanism there either, but basically your sensory receptions in your brain is cool, and you get confused. So you think you're really hot. So you start removing layers of clothes or something like that, even though you're really cold. And badness and badness ensues. Badness isn't the word I want. I was gonna say death, but it's not always death. Trouble ensues. Yeah. Pain and thank you. Yeah, pain and suffering. So that's different. So the frostbite is like direct damage to the external tissues, whereas hypothermia is your core body temperature becoming cold. And when I say cold, when we're talking about let's say frostbite, that's actually like those cells literally getting cold enough to like freeze, right? So below 0 degrees Celsius. So really, really cold. When we talk about hypothermia, that's your core body temperature getting down to, just a few degrees Fahrenheit colder. So let's say your core body temperature getting down to like 96 or something like that, 95, that can be really, really dangerous for you, even though it sounds really warm still, because your body just can't function when that core temperature decreases below a certain amount. I don't know exactly what those numbers are, but it's only a few degrees as compared to those externalities.
Maybe like that feeling of like getting cold and you're like really hot, where the inverse is like more of an response, because I'm trying to like compensate for like, oh, I'm really, really cold, I'm gonna try and heat up and like over exaggerate it or something.
Yeah, that sounds reasonable, but I don't know exactly what's going on. Well, we should look that up actually, because I'd be curious if it has to do with some sort of like response that can be beneficial in certain circumstances, or if it just has to do with everything going haywire and your brain just not being able to interpret sensory inputs and basically just getting confused and having no idea. Kind of like being dizzy or something like that. But dizzy instead of relation to like space, you're dizzy in relation to your temperature. You just can't tell. But I'm not sure. It's a good question. In a few more months, we might be wondering that as we walk to class in the dark in the morning in late November. Sounds fun, right? I didn't actually think about that in November, maybe December, it'll still be pretty dark out at 8 o'clock in the morning. Although we changed the clocks back, so it should be a little better. Hopefully it won't be too dark in here. Anyway, all right, let's talk what time we got. Oh, we got a few more minutes. Okay, we've talked about the general properties of epithelial cells as a whole. Now I want to move in and talk about different types of epithelial cells in more detail. So first, we can describe epithelial cells as being either simple or stratified. Stratified epithelial tissue simply refers to epithelial tissue that is a single layer of cells. Stratified epithelial tissue is simply, I shouldn't say simply, is epithelial tissue that is composed of multiple layers of cells. And the number of layers can vary, but the important thing here is there's more than one. So we have simple epithelia, stratified epithelia. Notice in both cases, we still have the apical and the basal surface, and the basal surface is attached to underlying connective tissue. So that's the first way we classify epithelial cells. The second way we classify them is by their shape. And we have three shapes of epithelial cells. We have squamous, cuboidal, and columnar. This simply refers to cells, squamous cells that are kind of flat and pancake-like. Cuboidal refers to cells, as you might guess, are more or less cube-shaped. And columnar refers to cells that are taller, more tall than they are wide, so they look like columns. We can then combine these descriptors to have 6 different types of epithelial cells. So we can describe them as being simple or stratified, and then we can describe them as being squamous, cuboidal, or columnar. By combining those terms, we then get these types of epithelial cells. We have simple squamous, simple columnar, and simple cuboidal. So simple squamous are primarily involved with diffusion and filtration. So this is, for example, the cells that line the air sacs in your lungs are simple squamous. They're very thin layers of cells that make it easy for gases to pass through them so that you can exhale carbon dioxide and inhale oxygen. We can then have stratified squamous, stratified cuboidal cells. So these are epithelial tissue that is in layers. And for example, stratified squamous are often epithelial tissue cells, tissues that provide protection. So for example, your epidermis of your skin that we talked about earlier. We also have layers of cuboidal cells, although we don't really see this too often. We don't see stratified cuboidal or stratified columnar cells too much. And we also have this other type, and I'll show you some examples of this. I want to mention the name right now, but don't worry about what it looks like. I'll show you in just a minute. We also have a type of stratified epithelia called transitional. This is basically these cells that are all kind of irregular shaped that allow you to stretch them. And so, for example, when they're not stretched, they kind of group up and they get kind of mushed together. But then when they stretch, they can still stay attached, but change their shape to become distended, but still maintain their connection. So can you guess, think about a part of your body that can be very small, but then can expand to accommodate a larger space. Do you have any guesses where you might find this transitional stratified epithelia? Yeah, bladder. Yep, that's the number one example right there. Because often your bladder needs to change size continuously. And so when it's full, it needs to be able to stretch, but of course you don't want it. You still want to maintain that integrity. You don't want it to be leaking urine into your body for obvious reasons. Now, epithelial cells also form glands. And there's 2 basic types of glands that we'll talk about. We have endocrine glands, and these are glands that don't have ducts, but just kind of excrete hormones through their cell membrane. We'll talk a little bit more about that in detail when we get to the endocrine system. But for now, I just want you to know that endocrine glands are ductless glands. And then we have what's called exocrine glands, which have ducts and carry their products and deliver it to a specific place. And so that are things like sweat and oil glands that cover all of your body, your salivary glands, which produce saliva and excrete it into your mouth, of course. Then you have glands of your liver and pancreas that excrete different enzymes and things like that into your digestive system to help you digest food. One kind of exocrine gland is called a goblet cell. And so these are unicellular glands, meaning the glands are just one cell that secrete something called mucin, which combines with water and makes mucus. So we have these cells, for example, in the lining of your respiratory airways, your trachea in the back of your mouth, and this protects your trachea. What it does is it creates this mucus layer that lines your trachea. So when you inhale, all of that mucus basically helps like collect dust and stuff like that so that it doesn't go into your lungs. And what happens to it then is basically little cilia pull all of that mucus up out of your trachea, and then it dumps it back down into your esophagus where you swallow it and digest it. Because usually digesting things like dust just doesn't really hurt you at all. And that dust, remember, mostly is those shed squamous epithelial cells from your friends sitting around you in class. And so you breathe them in, they get caught in the mucus, and the little hairs, the cilia, push that mucus back up, and you swallow it and digest it. That's a great story for today, linking all of these ideas about different epithelial cells. You're essentially digesting your friend's skin cells. Everyone's really glad they took human anatomy now. Let me pause there, see what questions you have. I have just a little bit more I want to talk about. I'm going to start in connective tissue, and then I want to wrap things up today. Go ahead, Jim.
So when you say this lens.
Mhm. Yeah, they don't have like a specific structure through which the molecules that they excrete go. They just kind of they move them out through their cell membrane, basically. And you'll see some examples of that. And now, honestly, right now we're not going to talk too much about these glands. I just want you to know that these are part of they're made from epithelial cells, or they're tissues composed of epithelial. They're epithelial tissue, better way to say that. And we'll get to them in a little more detail later in class. What I do want you to know is all of the different kinds of epithelial cells. And just as a note on that, you have readings in your class program for Friday that get into all of these in great detail and give you examples of where they are in the body. And then we'll spend a lot of time on this in lab next week as well. So I'm kind of giving it a little bit of a superficial treatment here in lecture, because we will talk about it in more detail in lab. And I think it's something that is easier to learn when you're actually looking through a microscope, looking at those tissues, rather than me just talking about it. Good. All right, let's talk for a second about connective tissue. This is our second tissue type in the body. And connective tissue all forms from the same, what's the word I'm looking for? Progenitor tissue in the embryo. This is called a kind of tissue called mesenchyme. And connective tissue is super diverse and abundant all over your body. In fact, most of your weight is made up of connective tissue. We have a couple of main classes of connective tissue, not a couple. We have what's called connective tissue proper. We have cartilage, we have bone, and we have blood. It's a little weird that blood is connective tissue, but you'll see why when we talk about it in detail here. Connective tissue is important because it forms your skeleton, so it gives your body structure. And when I talk about the skeleton, I mean not only bone, but also cartilage and other associated tissues. Connective tissue is important because it stores and carries nutrients. So for example, your bone is an active storage place for different, it's an active storage place for fat, for example. Adipose tissue is a kind of connective tissue that stores nutrients, etc. Connective tissue surrounds blood vessels and nerves. We saw that connective tissue layer underlying, attached to the basal layer of the epithelia, and we saw blood vessels and nerves traveling through that. And then importantly, your connective tissue includes a lot of structures that are important for fighting infection that are part of your immune system. So we'll talk about all those in a little more detail. But first, I want to go back to this mesenchyme. So mesenchyme is this this type of tissue that develops very, very early in development in the embryonic phase. And it's this kind of embryo connective tissue that looks like this. You can see the cells are these guys in dark purple, and then they're surrounded by what's called ground substance. This just refers to the molecules and structures that are kind of in between these cells. And then we have these different fibers that form between the cells that give that whole tissue its kind of structure. Now, I'm not going to ask you too much about this kind of tissue, other than knowing that mesenchyme is the tissue that gives rise to all of these other kinds of connective tissue. That includes cartilage, bone, blood, and connective tissue proper. And I'll talk about those all in more detail starting on Friday. And again, you'll see them in the lab as well. It's probably a good place to pause. We'll wrap up connective tissue and then talk about muscle tissue and nerve tissue on Friday. Let me just jump ahead here. All right, any questions? Okay, so a couple of reminders. Make sure you see your class program for Friday. There's lots of reading for Friday, although the reading I'm giving you for Friday, and I say this explicitly in the program, you don't have to have it done for Friday. It's a big chunk of reading on histology and tissue types, but we're gonna be revisiting it throughout the week, so it wouldn't hurt to get a jump on it for Friday. Also have details for quiz number 1. It is going to be an online quiz that is open book that will be open through the weekend. So it will open up, be available in Blackboard after class on Friday and be due before class on Monday. It's open book. You can use resources, you can use your notes, et cetera, et cetera. The only thing you can't use is each other. Please don't communicate about the quiz with each other, share answers or anything like that. It's kind of the honor system. I will mix up quizzes being in class or online throughout the semester. One thing I really want to emphasize with open book quizzes and exams is please use the resources that you have from class. Look up your answers from your class notes or from your textbook. Don't just go Googling answers because you'll get some whack-a-mole answers out of left field. That's stuff we never talked about in class. I find this very often with students that obviously didn't reference their notes. Instead, they just try to Google an answer. It's not cheating, right? It's an open book exam. You can do that, but it's not going to help you any. You'll get confused and you'll just get answers that aren't relevant to what we talked about. So my best advice for open book stuff, especially for this class, but probably your other classes as well, is stick with class materials to draw from your answers. There's more details in your class program for Friday. If you have any questions about that, just let me know either after class or just shoot me an email. One other thing, our tutoring sessions are starting with Danny. This week, he's going to start. They're going to be in our lab room, which you haven't been to yet, but it's room 301. They will be Mondays and Thursday evenings from 6 to 7. Basically, he's going to be in there ready and waiting for you to come and ask questions. We are going to start those this week, Thursday, which is great because you've got a quiz coming up. And we're going to set up a Zoom link as well if you want to take advantage of those but aren't on campus during those hours. And I'll get that information to you shortly. Last but not least, I've got a ticket out for you. Just a short survey with some questions from today's class. Helps me make sure that you're understanding the material. And I'll stick around for a minute if you have any other questions. Otherwise, I will see everyone in class on Friday.